Well, this is one of the consequences of or one of the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So in a way, it depends on how far back you want to go. There are some people who will even maintain that this is one of the consequences of the Second World War. So I don't know where we will start the narrative, but let's put it this way. There are some people in the Soviet Union, and Putin is one of them, who have never accepted the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They think it diminished their status, the status of their country in the world. They regarded themselves at par with the United States. And then the Soviet Union was collapsed, let's put it that way, collapsed. And they then they were still a great power, but they were no longer a superpower. At the end of the Second World War, there were a lot of countries who were forced to join Russia and become the Soviet Union. Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and of course, Ukraine. It will even interest you to know that Ukraine was one of the signatories establishing the United Nations. So when the Soviet Union then collapsed, a lot of these countries then became independent, including Ukraine. But Ukraine also then has a special part. Occupies a special position in the psychic or in the psychology of the Russians, because the Russians regard themselves as cousins of the Ukrainians. In the far, far past, when nations still had no boundaries in Europe, even Russia at one time was ruled from Kiev, from Ukraine, and it was monks from the monastery in Ukraine who went to Russia, who went to Moscow to form the Orthodox Church there. Of course, that Orthodox Church later broke into two, or even more than two. But you then had the Russian Orthodox Church, then you have a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. That simply shows that historically there was a link between Romania and Russia. This is not to say that I support going to grab nations because of some ancestral links in the far past. If we all did that, the whole world will be in turmoil. Do you know how many times the boundaries of European countries have changed? Several times. So you draw the line somewhere, and that's where we in Africa actually adopted the doctrine of in, accepting the boundary where you find yourself at independence. You accept it. You don't seek to change it for emotional reasons or for religious reasons or for any reason. And that's also the doctrine in Latin America. But in Europe, because of power play, boundaries are continuing to change. But anyway, not to drag out this historical analysis, since I don't know what other questions you are going to ask. The point I'm simply trying to make is that the Russians have regarded Ukraine as part of them. Number two, there is a large population of Russian-speaking people in the Ukraine. How did they get there? They got there during the rule of Stalin, who was fond of simply shifting populations around within the Soviet Union so that he can kill any attempt at the development of national sentiment. He pursued a deliberate policy of what you would call Russification of the Soviet Union. And he was the one who then transferred these millions of Russian speakers into Ukraine. So now for Putin to now claim that he's protecting those Russians, and that's why he has moved into Ukraine, he forgets the history of how those Russians got into Ukraine. You don't go around annexing other nations because you are trying to protect what are the minorities in that country. So that is where we've got to where we are now. Well, I don't know. And nobody knows. Nobody can read the mind of Putin. We have all been wrong in the past. The entire world. Nobody expected this. So we don't know the mind of Putin. But my suspicion, and that it could only be a suspicion, is that he is going to occupy probably the whole of Ukraine and then declare that Ukraine doesn't exist anymore. Of course, he can, like the Americans found out in Afghanistan, he can conquer Ukraine and occupy it, but can he maintain his occupation of Ukraine, especially if it's met by a determined guerrilla warfare of Ukrainian citizens? So there are too many ifs there. Even he himself should remember that the Taliban drove the Russians out of Afghanistan. So it's one thing to occupy a country. It's another thing to be able to hold it. So that's the first one. But implied in your question is, can this be subject to a copycat syndrome where other dictators in the world feel, oh well, they now have the right also to gobble up their weak neighbors and their small neighbors, whether in Europe or in Africa or in Latin America? Could that happen? And if that happens, it means We have destroyed the old world order, and we are seeking to recreate a new world disorder based on aggression, based on transgression of international law, based on transgression of the United Nations Charter. And I mean, we will all suffer considerably. Even for Putin, if he occupies the whole of Ukraine, will he stop there? Especially if he got away with it. If, say, in the next 18 months to 2 years, he can sustain his occupation, and he can sustain the the capability of the Russian economy in the face of sanctions. May he be tempted to now want to grab other neighboring states, Baltic states like Estonia, Lithuania, which were members of the Soviet Union in times past. Could he be tempted? So all of these are if. But the biggest if in all of this is, will NATO maintain a sustained, principled, and effective opposition to Putin? Or will the position of NATO gradually fade as European countries face the backlash to their own economies and to the, human beings are selfish. We may think we are not. We human beings are selfish. Yes, there is a lot of outpouring of grief about what is happening in Ukraine. And I will expand this because I've been a scholar of foreign affairs for about 65 years now. It is like our attitude towards climate change and environmental issues. We can see with our own eyes negative changes in the climate, and scientists have told us what we need to do. But each government wants the other government to make the sacrifice and not themselves. So countries that depend on coal, for example, to run their industries don't want to contribute their quota to climate change measures, to anti-climate change measures, because their people will revolt, or the government may lose the next election. Therefore, they will pledge to confront climate change, but continue with precisely what they have been doing. So now, today, there's a whole outpouring of grief. We're all shedding tears over what is happening in Ukraine. But the moment oil prices around the world start to rise, well, governments are going to start backing off from commitments they've made to sanctions on Russia, because they are thinking of the next election. So actually, the fate of Ukraine may be decided by democratic elections in other countries, where people will say, well, we don't want our standard of living to be negatively affected by these sanctions on Russia. They want their government to do a deal with Russia and let us get on with our lives. So that's why I say the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine depends on so many ifs, and the ifs I have outlined. Well, first of all, I'm trying to think of a country where sanctions have worked in effecting either government change or policy change. And it's interesting that you will mention Cuba, because for 60 years, America has maintained a regime of sanctions against Cuba. And the Cuban government has not changed, its policies have not changed. Yes, the country has been ruined by American sanctions, but that's about it. And so, no, the sanctions will not make Putin change his mind, especially since the sanctions are not, number one, going to be effective in terms of substance, and will not be effective in terms of their implementation. Putin has about $60 billion saved as a cushion against precisely this, sanctions, the effect of sanctions, so that the Russian economy could actually depend a lot on internal savings, as well as, of course, whatever national income can be generated from exports to China. Its export of oil has not been touched, and the dependence of the banking system of Russia on SWIFT, which is the procedure by which banks communicate, it has not been touched, because there are countries who are unwilling, European countries who are unwilling to sign on to a sanctions regime involving SWIFT. So you could see that even at this stage, where passions are still high, there are already divisions amongst European Union countries and their North Atlantic allies as to how effective or as to how far they should go in terms of on issues of imposition of sanctions. So, as far as sanction is concerned, I don't see this. For about 2 months now, they have been promising hellfire and brimstones economically if Putin did this. They had enough time to plan. They had enough time to argue amongst themselves. And then Putin did it. The first one he did, and he waited for the so-called sanctions that have never been seen before. He got a slap on the wrist. And then he decided to go in for full invasion. And I'm still not satisfied with the package of sanctions. I think they could have done more. Number two, you asked then the question on the relativity of the Cuban crisis. I was in the United States at that time as a student, and I lived through it. Of course, there's no morality in international politics. It's a power game. It is a power game. And also Putin is also saying what we did in Cuba, we also can do in our neighbors, in our own backyard. You forced us to back down in Cuba. I'm going to force you also to back down over this crisis in Europe. So it's but international politics is a game of interests and power, then dressed up, by morality. But the morality is just an outside coating. I mean, after all, in the 60s and 70s, when the United States went around the world claiming to be a defender of human rights, a defender of democracy, a defender of this and a defender of that, how was the United States treating its own blacks? In the 60s and in the 70s, they were still being lynched in the southern part of the United States. And nobody raised this issue, even in the UN. The Soviets were not noted for public relations. I think they thought this targeted ideological warfare is the weapon they can use. That turned out to be rubbish. Who listens to the ideology in any case? If the Russians if the Soviet Union have played a more informed game, do you know how many countries of color were in the United Nations, even by 1960, who, if you have a diplomacy of pointing out treatment of blacks in the United States and emphasizing that, will have proved receptive to those people. But instead, we came preaching Marxism, Leninism, comrade this, comrade that. Actually, the Soviets made a laughing stock of themselves, which they still do up to today. If you listen to the speech by Putin justifying what he had just done, it turned me off. It turned me off. It was so full of falsification of history. Then only this attention to, Catherine the Great, the Tsars, and so. If you want to talk to the world, that's not what you would do. They love, the Soviets, and this being a weakness of left-wing ideologues. They think the longer they talk, the more they can persuade you. His speech, which was over 1 hour, could have been given in 20 minutes, and it could have been more effective if he simply focused on the main issues. So the United States won the game. They won the game, the ideological game, because they knew, what issues to emphasize. And so people applauded the United States' firmness during the Cuban crisis. And it's still the same people who are also still applauding the United States' stand on Ukraine, forgetting, as Rai pointed out, that they took a similar position on Cuba. Until today, do you know the United States occupied by force a base in Cuba, the Guantanamo base. There, against the wishes of the Cuban people and the Cuban government. Can you imagine if it was the Russians who did that? Oh, the Americans will not allow the Russians to forget, nor for the world to forget that the Russians still occupy a part of a foreign country by force and is still maintaining it.